Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Welcome to 2021. It's already been a chaotic start, but I am remaining optimistic about the year to come. And one of the books I definitely recommend to get us all a little bit more optimistic and thinking a little bit differently, especially if you're involved in teaching or pursuits of knowledge, which is, let's face it, all of us, I hope. How to Think Like Shakespeare, Lessons from a Renaissance Education by Scott Newstok is a great choice, and I'm very happy to be speaking with him today. We recorded this a few months ago, actually, and I've been saving it for the beginning of the year, I think. Whether or not you're making resolutions or things of that nature, this is a great book to check out and think with. I mean, I would say the spirit of the book is just not a particular object to think about, although you could say education and flourishing, but thinking with a number of other people helps us all and is something we can all start to do in 2021, or at least that's my hope. As always, please check out tinap.org, where you can find Scott's recommended book readings and a little bit more information about him, as well as all of my other guests. You can find out more about the podcast. Thank you, as always, for listening to this and sharing it, and hopefully giving it a good review on whatever you're listening to it on. Scott, thank you very much. I'm honored to have you here as the first speaker of 2021. For people who don't know you, you are a professor of English and founding director of the Pearce Shakespeare Endowment at Rhodes College. You're also the author of Quoting Death in Early Modern England, The Poetics of Epitaphs Beyond the Tomb, as well as this book, How to Think Like Shakespeare, and a number of other great academic works. Let's start off just introducing the theme of the book. You have a number of meditations, I would call them perhaps, on different approaches. So not necessarily Shakespeare, although he's obviously a main part of the book, but just thinking through traditional ways that education once worked, and perhaps in some ways it should work again, although in other ways, of course, we've made progress. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and how you came to these sort of breakdown of ideas within it?
Sure. The book emerged out of two parallel and eventually converging strands in my life. One, as a teacher, as a professor, I had been reading a lot of great scholarship on the kind of intellectual and cultural infrastructure around Shakespeare during his life, his childhood, and his professional career that kind of gave him the material and the world to produce the kinds of works that he did. So a lot of great work has been done lately on the collaborative nature of theater and recovering what the humanist classroom might have been like in the 16th century. I've been reading a lot of that and thinking about that, and some of that has shaped my teaching and changed my teaching. I hope for the better, to think of Shakespeare as a maker who emerged out of a particular cultural moment. And then in parallel to, so here I am thinking about Shakespeare's thinking as his education as a teacher. And then in parallel, about a decade ago, my eldest child was starting to go to school, and my other two children were coming up behind her, and a number of the things that were frustrating about their education seemed to me to bring to light some of the still beneficial things about some of the humanist educational practices. So in effect, I was thinking about education in two different centuries, one immediately in my own life in the 21st century, and then one in the 16th century. And I had sometimes found the contrast jarring and the continuities interesting. I really wanted to find ways to think through what I valued about pre-existing models of education and what I found less thrilling about what some of my kids were experiencing in their own lives. So that all came together then in 2016 when I was asked by my college to speak to the entering class of 2020. I delivered that address, and then that turned into a short article, and then that eventually led to the book, which is a kind of elaboration of what that speech was trying to articulate. So it's a book that's trying to be aware of the present and current debates about education, and also certainly aware of the downsides of humanist education. I'm not advocating bringing back corporal punishment or single-sex education or excluding the poor or cultural minorities at all. But I am trying to think hard about what's still valuable about some of those practices that led to the flourishing of an entire generation of great writers and thinkers.
And there's a lot to unpack. I think one of the more impressive aspects of the whole work is just how you put together quotations and ideas from hundreds of years apart and just make it fit in a really interesting and intricate way throughout each chapter. I think maybe we can start to unpack education, and I think it's interesting also, as you said, you're thinking about younger children's education, also higher education, and everything in between. What, if anything, would you say has gone right from Shakespeare's time to now, like improvements in education? And I mean, maybe corporal punishment, eliminating that, and allowing poor people into schools is among the better things that have happened. So I'm just curious if you could maybe summarize some of your thoughts on what's gone better in education, but also maybe what has gone worse, or where have we gone in the wrong direction, perhaps?
Well, certainly the 16th century is characterized as an expansion of access to education, which still was a small fraction of the English Republic at that moment. So if you're going from, I don't know what it was at 1500 to what it was at 1600, but if you're expanding access to education, that on the whole is a good thing. And that has been a long-term global trend over the last 400 years. If you've seen charts of college completion rates over the last century, it's probably approaching something like 40%, maybe 38% right now. And even just a couple of generations ago, it was in teens and 20s. So, on the whole, that the laudable and radically egalitarian goal of providing access to education has been a slow but pretty consistent global process over the last half millennium. And it's very easy to point to the exclusions that were present in the 16th century, whether it's based on gender or based on class. We've done a lot of work to ameliorate that, and that's a good thing. But that having been said, we're nowhere near having created the level kind of playing field that I presume, would all want for living in a democracy. In some ways, I feel like the Zoom pandemic that we're all struggling through, the remote learning world that we're all in right now, has confirmed educational inequalities that we all should be aware of, but are very stark right now. So you hear reports of wealthy private schools being able to afford to have small in-person classrooms, while you often hear about public schools that are under-resourced that are having a great difficulty reaching their students remotely because of all kinds of problems: lack of access to the internet, lack of access to devices, households where there's not space for a child to think on their own without being surrounded by siblings or other responsibilities that they have. So, the long-term progress is good, but there's still an awful long way to go. And I at a moment, at a kind of crisis or pandemic moment like this, I think it's more clear than ever that that's not a story that has completed. So, a lot of my book it does not spend much time at all talking about the political background to what it would mean to provide genuinely universal, meaningful education. But we all know that it takes resources, and it costs money, and it takes time, and that we distribute those badly still to this day. Because of funding schemes and intergenerational wealth gaps and all the stuff we know about the larger social world are played out on the level of education. So,
yeah, one thing that stood out to me, and I want to just read it so I don't butcher it in a paraphrase or anything, was your idea about how we present people, but then we don't encourage people to think like the great thinkers we present them with. And what you write is, while we point to thinkers, Leonardo, Galileo, Newton, Darwin, Curry, who model the disciplined, independent, questing intellect we claim to revere, we enforce systems ensuring that our own young people could never emulate them. To me, that really struck a chord, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and the thinking that goes into that statement.
Well, right. I mean, I think one struggle that I had throughout the book comes out even in that statement as you're reading it aloud here, which is we have that word disciplined, which cuts in two directions, right? On one level, we have disciplined in the sense that we admire, which is like a great artist or a great athlete is disciplined in terms of doing the thing that they need to do in order to master the activity that they're in. And then we have the unfortunate, flip side of that, of discipline as being something that's kind of externally aggressively enforced with a shallow end in mind. So, when I was careful to struggle throughout the book to find terminology that I think is accurate to what we recognize in people who have been able to flourish in particular human activities, and then think about the kinds of conditions that we set up often for students that don't lend themselves to that kind of flourishing. So, in the bluntest sense, fixating on teaching to the test and working backwards from upping test scores tends to lead people to fixate on test-taking strategies rather than why is chemistry fascinating, or why is mathematics wonderfully mind-expanding, or why is it powerful to read language that's rhetorically sophisticated. I think on the whole that a lot of the reforms that have taken place, at least in the American public educational world over the last couple of decades, have led to a narrowing of opportunities for students because of that fixation on short-term evaluation or assessment or testing. And even those initiatives began with very laudable goals of increasing access to literacy and numeracy and improving graduation rates. They look like they've been counterproductive to me on the whole. So part of what the book's trying to do is acknowledge that as a fact. I don't think that's disputable at this moment, 10, 15 years into this, and say, okay, what's a more positive way that we can talk about education beyond numerical benchmarks that lead teachers and administrators to fixate on the numerical benchmarks alone?
Yeah, and I think, Shakespeare, obviously, as your book demonstrates, is a great example of someone who wasn't particularly disciplined in the sense that he was in a silo and spoke only to people who were doing the exact same thing as him, but he was, disciplined in other ways, like just in the act of writing and reading all of the time and in diverse ways or from diverse sources. Have you seen ways, and maybe you've implemented some ways, that you can kind of encourage that openness to thinking and to creativity even within a less than ideal school system, whether that's younger generations like people in grade school right now, or in your own university? Where are there opportunities that we might be able to find to kind of, I guess, open up the possibilities for what learning means?
Well, I hope it's also clear from the book that I'm not against teachers being evaluated and schools being evaluated and students being evaluated. I think the more that we can take care to recognize, numerical evaluation as limited benchmarks and not make them high stakes testing assessments, the better it tends to be for everyone involved in the system. And the more that those evaluations can be qualitative and entail the best of human judgment, the better they tend to be. But again, that's time consuming and costly in terms of human resources in a way that taking a bubble test is fast in comparison, that it's inexpensive and quick to force people to take that kind of exam. So, when I'm lucky enough to have small classes and I have the time to devote to my students, I love being able to spend lots of time on a regular basis encouraging them and responding to their writing on a near constant basis. That kind of labor, though, doesn't scale up, as you know. That doesn't translate into a 50,000 or 500,000 person online course where it's a lecture model. There are other things that can be attained, obviously, through that kind of model of information transfer. What I cherish in terms of the teaching that I do and the education that I've benefited from has not been that model of someone speaking from the podium to a massive group of people. Everything that I've seen in terms of research on classroom size at the grade school and secondary level confirms that. I think something we all know intuitively, that ideally a smaller classroom environment is preferable to a larger classroom environment because the teacher has more time to attend to the students individually. But again, that's a resource question when you get back to it that way. But I think there's that quotation from John Dewey that I have in the book that I think is just marvelous. It basically boils down to whatever you think would be best for your child, you really should think would be best for everyone. And it's fairly easy to pick on the hypocrisy of a number of very wealthy people who would never subject their children to the conditions that students have in under-resourced public schools, yet at the same time can claim that class size doesn't matter or outdoor recess doesn't matter, and all the kinds of things that they wouldn't put their own kids through I just think that Dewey ideal is a good one, and it's chastening for me, and I think it should be chastening for anyone that cares about education.
Hmm. Yeah, it's such a basic idea that is so, I don't know, just hard to grapple with in terms of watching what debates are going on in the education system in America when, yeah, it's very clear that a lot of the things people are saying they just don't believe, I don't think, because if they did, they would send their kids to the schools that they're proposing would have smaller budgets and larger classrooms
Hmm.
and everything, as you said. There's so much disheartening
Yeah,
aspects
yeah.
of this. But also, I think there comes across in your book and in a lot of people's discussions of pedagogy and higher ed, there's still obviously a passion, or else a lot of us wouldn't be doing it.
Oh,
But that
right. Yeah.
is, yeah, and that is something I've been thinking more and more about with COVID in particular. And that's one of the reasons I picked up your book and enjoyed it, was that ever since, like, I've been teaching online this term, and I've just been asking myself more and more, like, what am I doing? Like, what is
Yes.
the point of what we're doing? Because especially in a liberal arts or arts and humanities style classroom, it's not necessarily, well, I don't know if any classroom is necessarily take this, the banking model, and then spit it out when you're done. But some things may lend themselves more to that, some technical knowledge that you
Yes.
might need to know. But that's clearly not what you're doing usually in an English class or in a art class or whatever. I mean, maybe you could just start with that, if it, not to put you on the spot too much, but what are we doing? What are you doing when you're in a classroom trying to teach? Like, what does that mean and what does it look like? And maybe after COVID, it looks a little different for you. I don't know. Maybe you could just, speak to that.
Well, so many things that you say are ringing in my ears as true. I mean, one part of the issue is, what is the discipline, or what's the subject matter that's being addressed? I think you're totally right that there are some disciplines that are more conducive to being broken down into kind of micro units of information transfer, like mathematics and computer science and kind of Khan Academy videos that are
Hmm.
geared towards those activities. I think that is most suited to that kind of medium of information transfer, breaking down a math problem into discrete components or a theorem and then modeling it in 5-minute units. I don't think that is how people read. If it is a model of reading, it's remedial and frankly kind of soulless. So when I'm a teacher of literature written in English, when I am teaching something poetic or dramatic or fictional text, the creation of that thing was a complicated act, and the interpretation and conversation about that thing is a complicated act. And I still can't wrap my head around what the equivalent would be if I were to make a Khan Academy version of how to interpret this poem. And I don't know that it would be transferable in the same way that, if you've done a reading of this poem, then you can do the same thing in a reading of another poem. I mean, some things carry over, but in some
Hmm.
ways, each act is somewhat idiosyncratic to the reader and the seminar group and the teacher who's leading it and the historical moment in which they're reading it. So your initial point, I think, is also true that the the emergency in teaching online in particular has really forced all of us to say, like, what am I doing? What's at the heart of what I'm doing? And how can we best try to achieve that or try to pursue that given the limitations that we have. I've read about a lot of faculty who have shifted to more, as much as possible, again, with time and resources permitting, more one-on-one or more to the correspondence between the professor and the student, or one-on-one meetings in whatever online forum that you're using, in part because the larger the group is on Zoom, the less it seems like the interaction works. I mean, I'm doing the best. I know we're all doing the best we can, but it's trying to have a conversation about a complex text with 20 some people in Hollywood Squares boxes just does not feel like the same thing as it was when we were sitting around a table together. I've pivoted to doing much more brief but intensive one-on-one ongoing email conversations with students in addition to the things that we're doing together in class, and less large assignments, less large writing tasks, and more kind of micro tasks, and hoping that nudging on a regular basis can be more productive given the circumstances that we have than a conventional assign a 10-page paper for a midterm and never hear from me again kind of project
Hmm.
that maybe might be more typical during an in-person semester.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of us have been questioning how we do things a little bit and changing based on what we can and cannot do, right? I definitely have
Mm-hmm.
been reformatting a number of my classes and rethinking a lot of the pedagogical strategies with what's available to me.
Mm-hmm.
I've also been asking bigger sort of questions in my head, at least, and I'm sure you and others have as well. And I don't mean to be on the attack at all, but
Hmm.
why read Shakespeare? I mean, this is coming from somebody who's interested in arts and humanities and would never say that, we should all be doing STEM and only STEM, although not that there's anything
Hmm.
wrong with STEM. But how do you tell a student you ought to read Shakespeare, even if you are not an English major or literature major and you are taking this class because you need a credit? There is an inherent value. To me, it seems obvious to me, but also it seems more and more difficult, especially when we're doing tasks online where it may look more like, fill in the box about where Hamlet discovers this and blah, blah, blah.
Hmm.
It sort of deadens that experience, right? And people might easily say, well, Hamlet or whatever is a bunch of discrete broken down parts that I can just fill in on a test. And obviously that's not what I think any literature professor wants. But how would you tell a student or tell a concerned parent, this is why in the 21st century you ought to be reading Shakespeare?
That's interesting. I don't address it directly in classes, in part because the structure of enrollment has led them into the class in the first place. I hope that it's through my modeling of the excitement about all the kinds of doors that this kind of reading can open that keeps them engaged and keeps them wanting to do the work that we're doing together in the course. The director of the Folger Shakespeare Library, Michael Whitmore, has a good line that I think is applicable here, which is something like, he thinks of Shakespeare as kind of like the gateway drug to the humanities more generally, and that often you can trade on the cultural capital that Shakespeare has by default, both for good and bad, and use the presumed familiarity with his work or his status as a cultural icon as a way to talk about performance history and access to literacy issues and the dynamics of race and interpretation and gender and social casting and all kinds of fascinating things that can be opened up through engagement with this particular figure. The book, to be clear, is not saying people should read Shakespeare. In some ways, what it's trying to do is model and think through the kinds of intellectual habits or practices that can lead to greater rhetorical facility and verbal fluency. So, it's taking Shakespeare as the hook, but it really is thinking through those humanist practices and legacies that are still valuable in becoming a better writer and becoming a better thinker, I think. So I'm always careful not to over-valorize Shakespeare in the classroom. And one of the first things we often do is talk about how hyper-canonical that figure is in the American high school curriculum. This, that in the Common Core standards for literature in the secondary level, teaching literature are peculiar because they do not specify any content. They're maybe overly hesitant or agnostic about specifying any content at all. It's very skills directed, and that has its own set of problems. But they make an exception to that no content rule by saying Shakespeare. So they do name one figure and they name no other figures, which is, either name a lot of figures or name no figures. But they must have figured that figure was non-controversial enough that it wouldn't be a problem to name that one figure. But then it just reinforces a dynamic of seeing that figure as isolated and not part of a continuity of hundreds of years of writing and global appropriations and adaptations. And it kind of becomes a regrettably solitary figure, moted from the rest of intellectual history, and all kinds of things start to happen when that isolation takes place. He often becomes the only pre-20th century writer students read, and the only British writer they read, and the only verse writer they read. And so it turns him into an incredibly distant figure rather than someone who's part of a long continuity of writers and intellectual production across the globe. Mm-hmm. Why read Shakespeare? It's enormous fun. It's rich to see how, the more you think about how things work in his language and the pleasure that you can get from being part of a tradition of people responding to that writing. There's a surplus of scholarship on Shakespeare, so no matter what you're interested in, you will find someone intelligent who has responded to something similar to what catches your imagination. And I think that's fun. I think that's something I always like to model for my students about how cool it is that they can be in conversation with generations of hundreds of years of people who have been as beguiled or frustrated or fascinated by this figure as they are right now. Mm-hmm. So there's both the reading of the figure as well as the reading of the legacy of that figure and thinking your way into what's at stake in that legacy too.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think especially For me, it was interesting thinking that Freud, for example, was struggling with thinking about Shakespeare in the same way that we might, because he was, Shakespeare was a historical figure far preceding Freud. And so even though Freud is a historical figure, he's relatively new compared to someone like Shakespeare. And so he was thinking with him, and so many people have done that, as you said. Maybe we can switch gears slightly and talk about you writing this book. I mean, it's a really impressive palimpsest of so many generations of thinkers. It just goes back and forth with interesting and thoughtful quotations that string together, weave together meditation, I would call them, on each topic that you take on for a few pages, really. How do you put that together? Do you have a sort of system? I mean, obviously you're well versed
I
in
wish I had.
Shakespeare. But yeah, how do you get these people together? How do you put these people together and make
Uh,
sense of it the way that you do?
I had one friend who went after she read a draft of it. She asked me if I had like a room with a giant wall of quotations with like an X-Files kind of room detailing the scene of the crime. And I wish I had more of a system than I did. I'm a
Yeah, if we were going to recreate that, I think it would totally look like one of those crazy rooms with strings going from person to person, because that's definitely what it feels like looking or reading it. But yeah, that's
yeah.
why I'm curious about what goes on behind the scenes for you.
Let me just acknowledge up front that I know the way the book is constructed is a little bit risky in the sense that a single paragraph will leap across centuries and genres, and that can have a kind of whiplash effect if it's not done with some agility. So I worked really hard to not make that feel jarring, but I do know that for some readers that has been a frustration or a disappointment. Um, the it is the fact that the book emerged out of the commonplace tradition that was very characteristic of 16th, 17th century writers. And, it's to this day, we know that artists and creators of all sorts go through this very process of taking notes on things that they enjoy and that inspire them, and favorite singers and favorite lyrics that they like. Beyonce does that, and hip hop artists do that with their book of rhymes. And so this is nothing that's new, and it's something that's very old, being in that process of harvesting favorite passages and quotations for later reassembling in your own mind, in your own writing or your own artistic creation. So, part of it was a little bit of a gimmick to be in the spirit of that same dynamic of commonplacing that was a hallmark of humanist education and humanist literary production. Part of it is I've always just kind of worked that way. I think I pushed that mode of thinking and writing more than I ever have in my previous writing, in part because I really just wanted to harvest as many great insights as I could about learning and thinking and education and the imagination, and kind of pull them all together in one place. So, a lot of these things came out of classroom exercises where, some of them were initially handouts that I had produced over the years, and I found ways to synthesize those passages into the book. And then, eventually things started to cohere and make sense. The kind of clusters of topics started to emerge. And I guess I felt like I ultimately was kind of making a virtue out of, I don't know if it was a vice, but it was a fact that I had this enormous assemblage of favorite passages that I wanted to weave together into something like a quasi-coherent narrative. Mm-hmm. And then each chapter just started to emerge like a Bacon or a Montaigne essay that takes a topic as a moment of inspiration. It's not going to be the definitive statement on that topic, but attempts to weave together these thoughts and maybe inspire other people to think a little harder about what we mean when we talk about technology in the classroom, or what we mean when we talk about freedom in education, or when we think about values of imitation in artistic creation. So again, I know it's a risky gambit because it is not a historicist book. It's not, if you go into it thinking like this is going to be a study of Tudor education from 1545 to 1547, that's, you're going to be disappointed and frustrated and find it too loose. I was hoping that by ranging as widely as I could show some continuity in these practices or habits or whatever word you want to use, and make it more accessible potentially to a wider audience than, let's say, just Shakespeare scholars or Shakespeare lovers. Mm-hmm. If that strategy makes sense. So it is a kind of smorgasbord of a lot of different stuff, things that I love, and writers and thinkers whom I admire.
That comes across, and like you said, it's part of a tradition that goes back to the early essays of Montaigne, and the idea that, yeah, you can take a subject as a starting point to think about, but you're not coming up with like the 5 paragraph essay that we're training students to do. And I think that's definitely refreshing. Although I think one thing that was interesting is when I first asked you if you would come on this podcast, you seemed a little hesitant because it didn't necessarily fit with the people I had interviewed before. And that's, as I told you earlier, that's something that I've received that kind of comment in different ways from people. Basically, they're worried that the discipline that I'm interested in, which isn't very closely or tightly monitored. I mean, for this podcast, I tell people it's cultural studies, philosophy, and a bunch of other stuff, really, but it's kind of what interests me. And so I have had people interested in pedagogy, people interested in computer science, and people interested in high theory, if you want to call it that. But it does seem like more and more it's difficult to find a place that fits in academia. And so we tend to stick to our silos. I'm curious if you could say a little bit about disciplines in that sense. You said earlier that this is a popular, it's not one specific genre of study. Are there benefits that you found in doing that? And are there setbacks that you found in doing that where you're not clearly, a historicist study of a certain time period where you have an argument that you're trying to prove?
Well, I mean, we both teach at liberal arts colleges, and I think in some ways by default, in many good ways, we are forced to do that kind of argument in our classrooms because we're not, on the whole, dealing with, graduate students or people who will go on to follow our same professional paths. So, I think a lot of the book emerged out of my own teaching as well as out of my own extramural commitments. I do a lot of free public programming in Memphis about Shakespeare and Shakespeare-related topics. And I've always admired scholars who find ways to convey, complicated subjects in accessible terms without dumbing it down. Very few people are able to do that. I think it's a high level task because it means that you both have to know what's at stake in those complicated arguments and not be too remedial and act like your audience is stupid, but at the same time find ways to connect with that audience or that readership who aren't familiar with the scholarly discourse. So I admire that greatly. I know I have not quite pulled it off in the book, and I've erred in various directions, but I really liked trying. I really liked thinking about, is this the kind of thing that my parents could read and have it make sense to them? Smart, well-read people, but far stretched from a Shakespeare scholar? Or is it something that I could eventually see my children reading, or my friend who's a doctor, or my friend who works in the corporate world, or the retiree who comes to our continuing education classes at Rhodes College? Those were the voices that I had in my head as I was thinking about how to both construct the book on a macro level and then also trying to revise the sentences on a local level to make them intelligible. I really didn't want to get too in the weeds on any topic, and I had to prune. There's a ton of footnotes, and that's a fraction of what was there initially, thanks in large part to a really sharp series of editors at the press who were encouraging and good and firm about saying, if you want to do it, you can't let that overwhelm what you're trying to say. You need to think really hard about who that audience is and how best to reach them. So I'd like to think that the book is informed by all of the scholarship that I've surveyed on the history of education and the history of cognition and kind of parallel fields that I've been dipping into. But the task was to make that legible and I hope engaging and playful for a non-specialist reader. Again, that comes with risks because it does look like, jack of all trades and master of none. It looks like it's kind of dipping its toe into too many things that I'm not really an expert in, but I did my best, I think, in that very liberal arts spirit of trying to survey as much as I possibly could for each individual chapter so that I would feel confident that I was trying to make a clear case for what I care about in each chapter and that I had some validity in doing so, or I had some justification in doing so based on the fields of scholarship that I'd surveyed in preparation for each of them.
Yeah, and I think obviously you do a good job of taking high level sources, as you said, and making it accessible to most readers, I would say, I would hope. Do you think, and this is something I've been struggling with, and I'm curious what your take is, do you think most, I don't want to say all because you never want to be too prescriptive, but do you think it would be a good idea for most academics to do work that involves the kind of thing that you're doing now, which is making things accessible that wouldn't necessarily require a high level, like a PhD in literature or something? Do you think that ought to be a part of everyone's work, or do you think that every now and then it's fine to do, but we should stick to our specializations? If we're, doctors of literature, then we should
Hmm.
stick to high level literature stuff. I mean, there's obviously repercussions if you're trying to get a tenured position. Like if you're a tenure track professor, you will be pushed in the direction of the monograph that maybe 20
Hmm.
people will read, but it'll be
All
the
right.
20 most experienced people in your field, which may obviously have some benefits for the greater society, but at the same time most of the greater society won't be exposed to it. The other side, though, of course, is that yeah, if you end up looking like a jack of all trades and master of none, then why do you have, or why are you trying to get a high level position in an academy, perhaps? So, I mean, I've heard all of the arguments, I'm sure you have too, about the benefits and costs, but I'm wondering if you think professors or scholars or even maybe early level career like grad students getting their PhDs should do this kind of work, or maybe should avoid this kind of work in general.
That's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is I do think even if you never write for this fantasy of the general audience, your undergraduate students are that general audience.
Mm.
So in every day, we are all struggling with, in the best possible ways, of conveying informed disciplinary knowledge to novices who may never study with this again. And so this loops back to your earlier question about, why are we doing this, or what are we actually doing in the classroom? If this is the only course that the student is going to ever take for the rest of their life that looks at, let's say, just poetry, it's a pretty high bar in terms of trying to make that a valuable, meaningful, intellectually rewarding experience in a way that an 18 or a 20 or a 25-year-old can apprehend. So, I mean, that in a way, again, whether you end up writing with that goal in mind or not, I think on a daily basis, every teacher is doing a version of that. And I think we often underestimate how that is the general public that we have the greatest constant contact with on a often daily basis in our work. That having been said, I do think, let's put it this way, I don't think I could have written this book coming out of graduate school because I feel like I hadn't earned to myself, not to even to my peers, but to myself, I didn't feel like I'd earned the intellectual authority to make me confident enough to make the kinds of more general claims that I'm making in this book. So, in part, that's, this is a kind of classic sociological fact that it's partly by earning the intellectual authority within your discipline that then you can translate that into the authority of speaking in more general terms on behalf of that field of knowledge. And, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of John Warner at all, who has an ongoing Inside Higher Ed column and has also written great books about collegiate writing and the craft of writing. His most recent is called Why They Can't Write, and it's kind of the perils of the 5-paragraph essay that you were just mentioning earlier.
I've heard people reading that. I haven't read it myself yet.
It's great. I mean, he's very practical and ambitiously philosophical at the same time. And one of the things that he suggests that you do with your students is have them rework the same material for different audiences and different formats and different genres. So rather than having them do the X length, 5-page paper and having that be a one-off thing, he makes them do that paper and then has them write a précis of it and has them write like a blog post version of it, and then imagine what a longer research project would look like. So in some ways that I think that's a good local small model of what academics should be doing in general, translating their expertise into the classroom and potentially into other fora. I guess I wouldn't want to foreclose the good work that's done in the process of producing a dissertation and sharing that scholarship with scholarly communities. Sometimes you get the sense that in some proposals that people make about how to reform higher education, that some people just want to give up on that stage in the process and move directly to the immediate wider broadcast forms of social engagement. But I think those things are not antithetical. I think that in fact it's the earned or accrued authority that you achieve through the process of doing the research on the large scale and having it authorized by authorities in your field that then helps make you that much more compelling when you are speaking to your students or a group of retirees or your blog or your Twitter account or whatever the case might be.
I want to then ask you about something that's somewhat related, but can be open into other ideas as well. Is two of the different chapters that you have, sort of thoughts on focus on discipline and constraint, and there's another one on fit. So we're talking like fit and constraint, and then you finish the book with a discussion of freedom. And earlier in the book, you talk about how school itself derives the term from this idea of leisure, where we have the time away from everyday constraints to really think. I mean, you make the case, obviously, in the book that being disciplined in that sense, like of focusing, of doing exercises and constraining oneself is helpful. And that's what some people went to, perhaps an extreme in earlier generations, but also freedom and the idea of earning freedom. And freedom might not be the same thing. I'm sure you'll mention that freedom can be construed in different ways. Disciplines can be construed in different ways, as can constraints. But how do you weigh those ideas? Because they can seem quite opposite, right? Constraint and freedom seem to be at opposite ends to a spectrum, and yet they both, at least in your book, the way that you talk about them, seem to fit very nicely into basically an ideal education. So how do you weigh constraint versus freedom, and what do those terms mean?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, another one of my favorite quotations in the book comes from the great mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, who talks about, this is 100 years ago, he's thinking about problems in education and saying that at that moment he felt like people were rigid where they should be flexible and flexible where they should be rigid. Mm-hmm. And, I don't think that the answer to education or any philosophy of education should go too far to one extreme over the other, Charles Dickensian grand grindian rigidity, or the other extreme of like, do whatever you want and there's no curriculum and there's no structure whatsoever. So obviously I think, that's not fair. In my experience, I think every teacher that I've admired and learned from in all different kinds of ways has found their own version of almost like a dance between those two poles of rigid constraint and totally autonomous freedom. The trick or the craft or the art of being a good teacher is the kind of balance between those. And when, it's not dissimilar to parenting in terms of what kinds of constraints do you uphold and enforce and what ones do you abandon or jettison, and how that changes over time developmentally in relationship to the child or the student. I end the book with the chapter on freedom because I feel strongly that, it's not a new thing to say. It's a very Aristotelian thing to say that ultimately all of this infrastructure should help set you up to be a thoughtful, autonomous, articulate, fully flourishing human being that can participate in the world and contribute to the world. But that freedom, it's, it doesn't come from nowhere. You have a newborn child and you say, okay, you're free. You can do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. That makes no sense. I guess on the whole, the book is trying to take a lot of things that we might think are opposition or binaries and to do the kind of classic deconstructionist move of saying, well, they're not really binaries. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. So I don't see it being an opposition to say that working within constraint can be liberating. It might look like a paradox if you kind of work your way into the biography of artists or athletes or creators of all sorts. Most of them have chosen to work within certain limits so that they can have the opportunity to flourish at the high kind of capacity levels that they want within their particular endeavor. So there's tons of examples you can think of right away, like working within a poetic form, or even something like, mm-hmm. I say baseball games are 9 innings long. Like, that's a constraint, but there's all kinds of wonderful variety that emerges out of that constraint. And if we suddenly said, well, baseball games are going to be 2 innings long, that would be weird, because all of a sudden it wouldn't feel like baseball. It would feel like something else, or it would feel like short baseball or something. Or if you, change the length of a basketball court, or the time that you take to perform a certain activity, or if you're running a 99-meter dash and I'm running a 103-meter dash, it's not really the same thing. It's because we all agreed to us all running the 100-meter dash that we're able to see like who does that thing the best within that constraint. So, this is, in some ways, this is an old Miltonic notion in terms of thinking about liberty as being something different than licentiousness or license of doing whatever you want. Milton has a very rigid, rigorous sense of we agree to certain things that we do together in order to achieve human autonomy, but freedom is not. I mean, we can think of many examples from contemporary political realm where people will say, "I should be free to do whatever I want," and disregard public health rules. But in fact, it's by us agreeing to be constrained by some public health rules that we're able to have the freedom to breathe and be healthy. So I think it's an impoverished notion of freedom that thinks of freedom as meaning no rules, but rather it's like rules that we've agreed to work through together and debate and revise over time that allow us to have some degree of autonomy.
I won't even get started with the posters that have been going up near where I live in rural Georgia about freedom and freedom being the cure, not medicine or doctors. Incredible. But yeah, there is. Well, I think that, like I said, I don't want to go too into that kind of thinking, but we see an opposition, especially those who seem to oppose a liberal arts model, the school as a sort of leisure in the sense that you can explore things outside of the everyday and give yourself time to think. Those who oppose that kind of thing seem also to be very opposed to a lot of the, I don't want to say freedoms, but a lot of the, they see freedom as a way of avoiding that stuff. Like you should be free from that stuff. Whereas I think a lot of people who are writing books like yours are saying you should have the freedom to think with Shakespeare and think with all of these scholars. And what I'm most concerned about and interested in a sense, is having a sort of dialogue. Have you encountered any dialogues, like either participated in them or seen them perhaps, where those two opposing notions of freedom, the freedom from a liberal education that we don't want because we want to keep our kids in whatever homeschooling we're doing, versus a freedom to explore the humanities? Is there a way for those groups to talk? Because I personally haven't seen any successful ones as of late.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I have not seen examples of what you're asking for there. I mean, in my utopia, I would love to provide the opportunities for this kind of education that I cherish to everyone that wanted it. And then, going through that, then we could have all the interesting debates that we want about how curriculums work and how things get chosen and what's culturally valued and what's not and how that changes over time. But this is not getting to your question about seeing a good version of that debate. I'm stymied by that. I think that's lamentable. I can't think of that immediately. I do, that split between freedom from and freedom to, that old kind of classical political liberalism split. I do talk about that at the close of the book through an individual figure, through the figure of James Baldwin and his marvelous essay that I cannot recommend highly enough. I feel like if there's one thing that people come away with when they look at the book, is that they go and they read that essay, because it says everything I'm trying to say in more powerful and eloquent and concise terms than I did in the book. The essay is by Baldwin, is called Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare, and it was published in 1964, the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth. So a number of celebrities and intellectuals were asked to kind of weigh in on, like, what do you think about Shakespeare and why does Shakespeare matter 400 years after he was born? So that the title of Baldwin's essay is already an amazing title, Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare. You right away think, like, wait a minute, why did he hate Shakespeare? And then why did he stop hating Shakespeare? And what does he think about Shakespeare now? So it's a brilliant title, like all of Baldwin, provocative and personal and compelling and enticing and demanding and pushing you to greater insight. And he basically charts in just a few pages his, as he says, his initial resistance to Shakespeare and resenting it and feeling like it was a colonialist, racist imposition on him to be expected to read it. And then an amazing transformation that he has, in part generated by his time in France and his distance from the United States and distance from English language communities, that kind of brought him into a new relationship or new, more complex perspective on the legacy of, Shakespeare standing in for kind of Western culture and European intellectual inheritance, but as a shorthand, that resistance changes for him, and he comes to a new conclusion of feeling like this belongs to me, this belongs to everyone, and I have a right to inherit this as much as anyone. And in fact, it's part of my legacy, and I am an equal to this, and it is part of what everybody should have access to. So that's not getting at your question of a successful version of a difficult debate today. But I do think the short, fast, powerful drama that Baldwin walks through in that brilliant essay captures some of those dynamics about feeling like I want to be free from having to read X, Y, or Z, and instead feeling like, wow, I'm lucky, and this is as much mine as it is anyone else's, and I'm equal to it, and it's not external to me, but in fact something that I value as much as anything else.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that because I do think that helps a little bit in the other question as well, in terms of what people are seeing education as being free to or free from. I think if we could somehow transpose those ideas onto a lot of the political debates going on right now, we would have a better conversation.
And part of the book is struggling with trying to articulate the long-term utility of this kind of education versus the short-term utility and use of other more vocational, more immediately vocational modes of training. That's a perennial debate. Michael Roth has a good book called Why the University Matters, Why Liberal Education Matters. And it traces that debate going back to the American colonies. It goes back to Plato. There's nothing new about that debate, but we do see it in the latest iterations of politicians saying things like, we shouldn't be teaching philosophy, we should be teaching plumbers, and those things look like false oppositions to me. I mean, one of my best friends is a philosopher who teaches at a community college who literally teaches Plato to plumbers, and that's meaningful to them in a way that why would you not have the opportunity, give someone the opportunity to study philosophy if they wanted to, no matter what their career path is. And it's a kind of false opposition, like either you're going to have jobs training or you're going to have liberal arts education. And, the liberal arts side of it is partly to blame as well by isolating that and acting as if that's effete and something separate, exalted from handwork or craft work or career-oriented work. So ideally, you would have an education that would blend that in all the best forms. And, one of the pitches of the book is to try to say that craft is a governing conceit that helps us think through and articulate what we care about in everything from plumbing to philosophy, and everything from physical activities to more abstract intellectual activities. And in fact, physical activities are suffused with intellectual activities, that they're not separate, and that craft is actually one of the best ways to describe what's at stake in all of those activities.
Yeah, and I don't remember if it's that chapter on craft or a different one, but definitely it struck me as important. One of the distinctions you make of the idea of teaching for teaching's sake or learning for learning's sake versus seeing it as part of a larger system in which, if you are exposed to philosophy as this is for you to gain a doctorate of philosophy, if not, why are you here? Then obviously a lot of people are going to be uninterested in pursuing that kind of philosophy. And I think that is how, regardless of intentions, that's sometimes presented to students, right? Like, you can be a philosophy major and you can study all of these books, or you don't bother or something. Whereas if we saw it as you can read Shakespeare to learn a little bit more and still be a great plumber or a great accountant or whatever, I think that would be ideal. And I think that's definitely the message I got from the book, is that you can read Shakespeare and be a great accountant. You can read Shakespeare. It doesn't have to be your whole time and your whole lively endeavor, because most people aren't going to be doing that. But that doesn't mean you should cut yourself off from these disciplines, even if you're not going to pursue them to be a Shakespeare professor or something. I'm curious, though, as we start to sort of wrap up our conversation today, if you could see, or if you could ask people to do or to follow a couple ideas from the book. So assuming people have read the book and are, in a diverse range of positions, in terms of age, in terms of employment, all of these things, what are some things that you would hope that people would maybe start to do or start to practice, or even just start to think about more having read this book?
I guess one small, modest thing would be to encourage people to create their own commonplace books as they're harvesting favorite quotations and words and things that have inspired them, and use that as a way to archive their thoughts I think that's never a bad thing, and that's always been a productive thing for people from all kinds of social classes. I think that also can encourage a greater attention to the way we say what we say, and if you're archiving or transcribing writers and thinkers and singers and artists whom you admire, that as you look at the way they've articulated what they've said, that might in turn ideally help you articulate what you want to say in other circumstances down the line. So not that they have to go through the kind of imitation practices that I detail in the book that were characteristic of Tudor education, but I think the more you can just slow down and appreciate a great line or a great phrase or a great sentence, the more likely it is that you might help yourself improve and become more clear and more compelling in your own writing, whether that's an email or an annual report or any form of your articulating yourself to the world. The more you're attentive to different models of ways of saying things, the more likely it is that will have a kind of good downstream effect on your own writing habits.
Yeah, it's powerful for, I think, everyone, whether or not they see themselves as writers, as you said, collecting and thinking through these ideas. I mean, the book is a great model for that in itself.
In some ways, the pandemic has underlined how much we are all writers now. I mean, so much of business is being conducted via email, and I hear time and again from friends who are frustrated by their junior colleagues who are not able to write a clear email. I mean, that might seem like a simple task, but it's incredibly beneficial if you're able to convey complex things in clear prose and in an efficient manner. And the more, I don't know, I have countless anecdotes of students who often didn't have a credential when they went into a particular workplace, but because they were a good writer, had a kind of shockingly fast promotion up the ladder, because it's really hard to train that on the job, and it's incredibly valuable whether you are a doctor writing up a report or whether you are, a manager that's having to detail some kind of an account of what happened at your workplace. It's a high level human activity, and it's not easy to do. And so the more that people practice that, I think the better it is for themselves, and often indirectly for their career, and ideally for them becoming a more active participant in their communities and their world. And I'd like to think that has spillover effects for civic democratic participation as well.
Yeah, I think, going back to our earlier discussion of why read Shakespeare, I think that's perfect, is that it's not the knowledge of Shakespeare's plays, but the ideas behind studying literature in general that allow people to participate in these ways, whether it's from sending an email or discussing a recent political event. I totally agree. Scott, before we wrap up, I'm curious, are you working on a new book or new activity that maybe follows in this, or are you going in a different direction? What's on the horizon?
Well, I mean, the book really does sum up everything I care about education, and so in some ways I feel like I've said what I need to say. However, I am thinking through a project right now. As you note from the book, there's a couple heroes, on kind of tacit heroes throughout the book. One is Erasmus as the great humanist educator. Another is Kenneth Burke as this brilliant, self-taught genius of rhetoric of the American 20th century. And another is Michel de Montaigne, who wrote both directly about education and indirectly about education throughout his essays. So I would like, I'm in the process of proposing a kind of selection of his essays related to education and learning and writing and thinking. So there's a couple essays that are like titled "Of the Education of Children" or "Of Pedantry" that obviously would be in there. But there are other moments throughout his works where he will reflect on the value of reading and the value of writing and frustration with his own education and ideals that he has. And I think that would be a fun thing to compile, and I think it would be a fun thing to read. So that's what's on my mind right now, is not me saying what I have to say about education, but helping kind of gather, I guess, another commonplace book of kind of greatest hits of Montaigne on education.
Yeah, that sounds great. I look forward to seeing that. I hope that does come to fruition.
I hope so.
Scott, like I said, I really appreciate you speaking to me today. I think How to Think Like Shakespeare is great in so many different ways, as we've only sort of started to highlight with this conversation. And for me, it came just at a perfect moment when I was asking myself sort of a lot of the questions that you delve into in more detail in the book, and so it was just a nice happenstance to find it when I did, and I definitely recommend it to others, no matter what their disciplines are. I really do appreciate you speaking to me about it. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Chris. That's very generous. I enjoyed talking to you.
As always, thank you very much for listening to This Is Not a Pipe podcast and supporting it in whatever way you can. Hopefully, you've been able to leave a good review or tell people about it, or just, pass it on, or even just send good vibes this way. I am really hopeful about 2021. I think we've already, to a more or less extent, got off to a good start. Things will get better. I hope everyone is doing as best as they possibly can be, and that things continue to get better for all of us out there, and that we all, among other things, get to read some great books and think through some challenging and yet rewarding ideas, like Scott, I think, encourages us to do with his book, How to Think Like Shakespeare. Don't forget to check out tinap.org to see his book recommendations and more about him and all of our guests. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.